The first sign was the unnatural silence. Amidst the cacophony of the distant, frantically relayed evacuation warnings over strained loudspeakers and the rising, panicked chatter of her neighbors in an already chaotic community clubhouse, Dr. Lena Washington registered a pocket of stillness that felt profoundly wrong. The emergency generator hummed a discordant bass line to the human fear, casting flickering, unreliable light across stressed faces. They were supposed to be moving, preparing to leave. A wildfire whipped by unpredictable winds was encroaching on the outer perimeter of their suburban development, Oak Haven Estates, and the order to evacuate had come down barely 30 minutes ago. Lena, Chief Federal Child Welfare Officer for the United States, was by ingrained habit assessing threats, observing vulnerabilities. Her professional instincts were warring with her civilian need to ensure her own elderly mother, who lived with her, was safely prepped to leave. She'd just settled her mother with a bottle of water and her medication bag in a designated waiting area when she noticed Sarah Young Leo's mother, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror, arguing vehemently with Carol Baxter, the self-appointed queen of Oak Haven's HOA. Carol, a woman whose sharp features and even sharper tongue had already made her infamous within the community for her rigid enforcement of trivial rules, was shaking her head arms, crossed a look of grim, misguided authority on her face. "He's perfectly safe, Sarah. Panicking will only make things worse for everyone. I've secured him." "Secured him, Carol. He's a child. He needs me. He'll be terrified. Where is he?" Sarah's voice was raw, desperate. Leo, her 8-year-old son, was autistic and largely non-verbal, relying on a specialized tablet for communication. He was a gentle soul, but unfamiliar situations, loud noises, and especially separation from his mother could send him into a spiral of overwhelming anxiety. He was causing a disturbance. Carol stated, her voice cold, cutting through Sarah's distress. "Running around making those noises. In a crisis like this, we need order. I've put him somewhere quiet where he can't hurt himself or disrupt the evacuation process." What noises? He was scared. He needs his tablet. He needs his routine. Sarah was close to tears, her hands twisting together. Lena felt a cold dread begin to snake up her spine. "Mrs. Baxter," Lena interjected, her voice calm but firm, stepping forward. "Where exactly is Leo?" Carol Baxter turned her eyes small and hard, flicking over Lena with dismissive impatience. Lena Washington was a relatively new resident, a black woman who mostly kept to herself, and Carol had already cataloged her as someone who didn't quite fit the Oak Haven mold she so fiercely tried to curate. "Ms. Washington, this is an HOA matter, an emergency protocol. I have it under control. The child is secured." "Secured where?" Lena pressed her professional alarm bells, now screaming. The term secured, when applied to a distressed, disabled child by someone like Carol Baxter, especially in a crisis, sounded less like protection and more like imprisonment. Carol gestured vaguely towards a narrow hallway leading to the back of the clubhouse. "In the old records room. It's quiet and locked. For his own safety, of course, and ours." Lena's blood ran cold. The old records room was windowless, poorly ventilated, and essentially a concrete box filled with dusty filing cabinets. "Locked," she repeated, her voice dangerously soft. "You locked a disabled child alone in a windowless room during an evacuation order." Sarah let out a choked sob. "Oh my God, Leo!" Carol bristled. "It was necessary. He was becoming unmanageable. We can't have individuals compromising the safety of the group. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to coordinate with the volunteer fire wardens." She made to push past them. Lena moved, blocking her path. It was a subtle shift, but her entire demeanor changed. The concerned neighbor vanished, replaced by something far more formidable. "No, Mrs. Baxter, you're not going anywhere. Show me to that room. Now." The authority in Lena's voice, sudden and absolute, gave Carol pause. For a fleeting second, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Carol's face, but it was quickly replaced by her usual arrogance. "I am the HOA president, Ms. Washington. I will not be ordered around. And Lena set her eyes like polished obsidian. "I'm telling you that you have just committed a serious offense. You will take me to that child, or I will have the authorities currently managing this wildfire evacuation divert resources to deal with a kidnapping." The word kidnapping hung in the air, stark and ugly. Carol's face paled slightly. Sarah looked at Lena with a dawning, desperate hope. The distant wail of a fire truck underscored the urgency, the escalating danger both outside, and Lena now knew with chilling certainty inside this very clubhouse. The unnatural silence she'd first sensed now had a name. It was the silence of a terrified child, unlawfully confined. Lena Washington's world was usually one of policy documents, thick enough to stop a door of congressional hearings where she defended budget requests for child protection services and of late-night calls about systemic failures in foster care systems across the nation. Her office in Washington, D.C. was a command center in a never-ending war against child abuse, neglect, and exploitation. As the Chief Federal Child Welfare Officer, a position she had earned through decades of tireless advocacy and a fierce, unwavering commitment to the nation's most vulnerable, her days were a maelstrom of strategic planning, interagency coordination, and the constant heavy weight of responsibility. She had seen the worst of humanity, but also the incredible resilience of children and the dedication of those who fought for them. She and her husband Marcus, a thoughtful university professor of urban planning, had chosen Oak Haven Estates for its reputation as a diverse, family-friendly community with good schools and plenty of green space. They'd hoped for a haven, a place where Lena could decompress from the relentless pressures of her job, where her own mother Grace could enjoy her retirement in peace. Oak Haven was on its meticulously landscaped surface a picture of suburban tranquility. Lena, acutely aware of the subtle and overt ways racial and social dynamics played out, had noted its mixed demographics, with approval hoping it signaled a genuinely inclusive environment. She had met Sarah and Leo a few months prior at a neighborhood block party that Carol Baxter had organized with military precision and an unyielding insistence on a specific brand of artisanal lemonade. Sarah was a young single mother, a graphic designer who worked from home to be available for Leo. Leo, with his wide, observant eyes and a smile that could melt glaciers when it occasionally appeared, had immediately captivated Lena. He communicated primarily through an app on his tablet, his small fingers flying across the screen to form sentences or select icons that conveyed his thoughts with surprising clarity when he was comfortable. Lena, who had a deep understanding of various childhood disabilities, had engaged with him, patiently admiring his bright curiosity and Sarah's gentle, unwavering support. She'd seen the love that enveloped them, a fierce, protective bond that was both beautiful and, as she knew too well, potentially vulnerable to the insensitivities and prejudices of the outside world. Carol Baxter had made her presence known from the moment Lena and Marcus had moved in. Notes about the precise allowable height of their mailbox flag, unsolicited advice on appropriate lawn ornaments, none, and a general air of proprietary oversight that grated on Lena's nerves. Carol was the self-styled matriarch of Oak Haven, her power derived from the HOA bylaws she wielded like a scepter, and the network of equally officious or easily intimidated residents who formed her loyal council. Lena had observed Carol's interactions with other residents, noting a distinct pattern, a subtle but persistent targeting of families of color single-parent households or anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of ideal. There were complaints about ethnic cooking odors, unsupervised children playing too loudly, often directed at Black and Latino families, and unsightly disability aids like ramps or support railings. Lena had filed these observations away, a familiar unease settling in her. It was the low hum of systemic bias she fought on a national scale, now buzzing uncomfortably in her own backyard. The wildfire had started 2 days ago, in the dry, drought-stricken hills, several miles west of Oak Haven. Initially, it was a distant plume of smoke, a news item. But then the winds had shifted, growing erratic and strong, pushing the blaze with terrifying speed towards the suburban sprawl. The air grew thick with the smell of burning wood, and something acrid chemical. Ash began to fall like a sinister gray snow. This morning, the pre-evacuation warnings had started urging residents to be prepared. Then barely an hour ago, the full evacuation order came through. Oak Haven was directly in the fire's unpredictable path. Panic, as it often does, had bloomed quickly. The clubhouse, designated as a temporary assembly point before organized busing to shelters further inland, was to begin, became a hub of anxious activity. Carol Baxter naturally had seized control, armed with a fluorescent yellow vest that proclaimed HOA Evacuation Coordinator, a role she had presumably invented for herself and a megaphone, she barked orders, her voice amplified and shrill, often adding to the confusion rather than alleviating it. It was amidst this controlled chaos that Leo had his incident. Sarah later recounted to Lena, her voice still trembling, that Leo had been understandably agitated by the smoke, the sirens, the panicked energy of the crowd. He had begun to rock a self-soothing behavior and to vocalize his distress with repetitive sounds, not screams, but anxious hums and murmurs. His tablet, his primary means of expressing specific needs or fears, had been momentarily misplaced in the rush to pack their go-bags. Carol Baxter had descended upon them. "Sarah, you need to control your son." She'd snapped her face tight with disapproval. "He's upsetting people. This is an emergency we don't have time for. Theatrics." "He's not having theatrics." "Carol, he's scared," Sarah had pleaded. "He's autistic, the noise, the smoke. I just need to find his tablet." Frankly, his condition is not the community's problem right now. Carol had retorted, her prejudice laid bare. "If you can't manage him, I will." And before Sarah could react, Carol had beckoned two of her HOA cronies, burly men, who looked more like bouncers than concerned neighbors. "Take him to the records room. He'll be quiet there. It's for the best." Sarah had tried to intervene to explain, but Carol had physically blocked her, her voice rising. "We need to maintain order." "Sarah, he's a safety risk. What if he runs off into the smoke? What if he panics and causes a stampede? I'm doing this for his protection." She'd then ordered Sarah to wait in a separate area of the clubhouse with the other mothers and children who can behave, effectively separating them and leaving Sarah distraught and powerless, her protests drowned out by the general noise and Carol's overbearing pronouncements. This was the situation Lena had walked into the initial horrifying act of Karen, Carol Baxter, singling out Leo, misinterpreting his disability-related behavior as a threat, and callously, cruelly separating him from his mother under the guise of emergency protocol. It was the spark that would ignite a confrontation far more intense than the wildfire threatening their homes. The hallway to the back of the clubhouse was dimmer, the flickering emergency lights casting long dancing shadows that seemed to writhe like malevolent spirits. The smell of old paper dust and a faint lingering scent of industrial cleaner was thick in the air, overlaid by the increasingly pungent aroma of smoke seeping in from outside. Each step Lena took beside a reluctant, increasingly nervous Carol Baxter with a frantic Sarah just behind them felt heavy-laden with a terrible foreboding. "It's really not necessary for you to be involved, Ms. Washington." Carol tried again, her voice lacking its earlier conviction. "The boy is perfectly fine, just a little overwrought. He'll calm down once he's alone for a bit." "Mrs. Baxter." Lena said, her tone glacial. "The act of locking a child, any child, but particularly a disabled child with known communication challenges in a room against their will and that of their parent is not a calming technique. It is unlawful imprisonment. It is child endangerment. And in this specific context, given Leo's race and disability, it carries strong indicators of a hate crime." Carol stopped dead. "A hate crime? That's absurd. I was just trying to maintain order. He was a disruption. A black autistic child expressing fear in a terrifying situation is not a disruption to be managed by solitary confinement, Mrs. Baxter." Lena corrected, her voice precise and cutting. "He is a human being with rights you have apparently decided to summarily suspend." They reached the door to the records room. It was a heavy fire-resistant door painted an institutional beige with a sturdy commercial-grade lock. A small handwritten sign taped crookedly read, "Quiet Zone, authorized personnel only." It was clearly Carol's handiwork. "Where is the key?" Lena demanded. Carol fumbled in the pocket of her fluorescent vest, her hand visibly shaking now. She produced a small, tarnished key. "See, he's safe, locked away from the chaos." Lena ignored her justification. "Open it!" As Carol's trembling fingers struggled with the lock, Sarah pushed forward, her voice a ragged whisper. "Leo, honey, it's Mommy, can you hear me?" There was no response from within, only that awful, pressing silence. The click of the lock turning sounded unnaturally loud. Carol pulled the heavy door open a few inches, peering in hesitantly. The first thing that hit them was the stuffiness of the air, then a small whimpering sound. Lena gently pushed past Carol, her eyes adjusting to the dimness within. The room was small, no more than 10 by 12 feet, crammed with gray metal filing cabinets that left little floor space. There were no windows. A single bare bulb in a ceiling fixture powered by the struggling generator cast a weak yellowish glow. And there, huddled in the far corner, between a stack of old ledgers and a towering cabinet labeled Archived Bylaws, 1985-1995, was Leo. He was curled into a tight ball, his small hands pressed hard over his ears, his body trembling. His face, when he briefly lifted it, was streaked with tears and smudged with dust. His beloved communication tablet lay on the floor a few feet away from him, its screen dark, apparently out of power, or perhaps thrown aside in his distress. He was making that soft, keening sound again, a sound of pure, unadulterated misery and fear. Leo. Sarah cried, rushing past Lena, heedless of anything else. She knelt beside him, gathering him into her arms, murmuring soft, comforting words, her own tears flowing freely. "Oh, my baby, my poor baby, I'm here, Mommy's here." Leo clung to her, his small body racked with shudders, but he made no sound other than those heartbreaking whimpers. He buried his face in her shoulder, seeking solace, seeking safety. Lena's gaze swept the room, taking in the details with a cold, professional fury. There was no water, no chair, no comfort item other than the useless tablet. The air was close and stale. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light. This was not a quiet zone. This was a cell. She turned to Carol Baxter, who stood hovering in the doorway, her expression now a mixture of fear and a dawning, horrified understanding of the magnitude of her misjudgment. Or perhaps Lena thought just fear of the consequences. "He was like that when I brought him in," Carol stammered defensively. Upset, this was meant to calm him down, give him space. Space. Lena echoed her voice, dangerously low. "You isolated a terrified, non-verbal child in a dark, locked room without his primary means of communication, without his mother during a natural disaster. You deprived him of comfort, of support, of his basic human dignity. What you call space, Mrs. Baxter, the law calls abuse." She took out her phone, its modern sleekness, a stark contrast to the archaic squalor of the records room. Her fingers moved with practiced speed. Carol watched her eyes wide with a new kind of terror. Who are you calling?" Carol whispered. "The local police, I can explain to them." It was an emergency. Lena didn't look at her. Her call connected. "This is Chief Washington Federal Child Welfare. I have an active code amber situation. Unlawful detainment and endangerment of a disabled minor. Location is Oakhaven Estates Clubhouse, 1100 Oakhaven Drive. The child is a black male, approximately 8 years old, autistic, non-verbal. He has been located and is with his mother, but requires immediate medical and psychological assessment. The perpetrator is on site." "Yes, I am on site. I need an immediate federal response team and coordinate with local law enforcement for secure extraction of the child and parent and detainment of the perpetrator. This is now a federal crime scene." Carol Baxter's jaw dropped. Her carefully constructed world of HOA dominance and petty tyranny visibly shattered. Federal child welfare. She choked out, her face ashen. "Chief Washington, but you live here. You're just a resident." Lena ended the call and finally met Carol's gaze, her own eyes filled with a cold, righteous anger that had been simmering for months now, brought to a boil by this monstrous act. "Yes, Mrs. Baxter, I live here, and I am Dr. Lena Washington, the person who leads the nation's fight to protect children like Leo from people like you. You didn't just mismanage an evacuation. You didn't just inconvenience a resident. You targeted a vulnerable child. You abused your perceived authority in the most despicable way, and you did it all while a wildfire was bearing down on us." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Welcome to the full extent of your miscalculation. Your emergency is just beginning." The arrival of the federal team, even amidst the broader chaos of the wildfire evacuation, was a masterclass in controlled urgency. Within 20 minutes, 2 unmarked SUVs, somehow navigating the increasingly congested and smoke-filled roads, arrived at the Oakhaven Clubhouse. They weren't men in tactical gear. These were plain-clothes professionals, a social worker specializing in trauma, a child psychologist, and 2 stern-faced federal agents from Health and Human Services Office of the Inspector General, the enforcement arm that worked closely with Lena's office. Lena had already moved Sarah and Leo to a quieter, cleaner office in the clubhouse, one with a window, though the view outside was an increasingly apocalyptic orange haze and comfortable chairs. She had found a power outlet for Leo's tablet, and as it slowly came back to life, so too did a small spark in Leo's eyes. He was still clinging to Sarah, but the whimpering had subsided, replaced by an exhausted watchfulness. The federal social worker, a kind-faced woman named Maria Ramirez, immediately set about creating a calm space for them, speaking in low, soothing tones, offering Leo a bottle of water and a small, soft toy, a preparedness item she always carried. The psychologist observed, quietly making notes. Carol Baxter, meanwhile, was being interviewed, or rather interrogated, by the two HHS agents in another part of the clubhouse. Her attempts at justifying her actions, her pleas of misunderstanding and emergency necessity, were met with methodical, implacable questioning. Her fluorescent evacuation coordinator vest now looked like a ridiculous costume. Her authority, so absolute just an hour earlier, had evaporated like mist in the face of genuine federal power. The first layer of the twist, Lena's identity and the swift, decisive federal intervention, sent ripples of shock and disbelief through the remaining residents and local emergency volunteers at the clubhouse. Whispers followed Lena as she moved, coordinating Leo's safe passage out of the potential fire zone. "That's Dr. Washington, the one who lives on Willow Lane. They say she's some kind of high-up government official for kids." The story of the HOA president unlawfully locking up a disabled black child, only to discover one of her own residents was the nation's top child welfare officer, was the kind of drama that overshadowed even an approaching wildfire. But the second layer of the twist, the deeper, uglier truth behind Carol Baxter's actions, began to emerge as Lena's team in the days and weeks that followed after the immediate wildfire threat had passed. And Oak Haven thankfully had been spared the worst of the flames due to a last-minute wind shift and heroic firefighting efforts delved into Carol Baxter's tenure as HOA president. This wasn't just a panicked overreaction in a crisis. This was a pattern. Interviews with other Oak Haven residents, particularly families of color and those with children who had special needs or disabilities, painted a disturbing picture. Carol Baxter had a history of using the HOA bylaws and her position of power to harass and intimidate. There were documented complaints previously dismissed by a compliant or indifferent HOA board, many of whom were Carol's cronies, about her discriminatory practices. Fining a Latino family for excessive noise during a child's birthday party, while similar events hosted by white families went unremarked. Repeatedly demanding an Asian family remove traditional cultural decorations from their porch, claiming they violated aesthetic guidelines, though no such specific guidelines existed. Attempting to block the installation of a wheelchair ramp for an elderly resident, citing community appearance standards until threatened with legal action under the ADA. And most chillingly, previous incidents involving children with disabilities being singled out for disruptive behavior at community events, with Carol suggesting they be kept at home or better controlled by their parents. Investigators discovered that Carol had been subtly trying to engineer a more homogeneous Oak Haven one that matched her narrow, prejudiced worldview. She believed, as evidenced in some ill-advised emails recovered from the HOA's server, that diversity and disability lowered property values and detracted from the community's prestige. She had even explored ways to amend HOA bylaws to make it more difficult for families with high-needs individuals to move in or stay. The imprisonment of Leo, then, was not an isolated act of poor judgment under pressure. It was the horrifying culmination of a long-standing, calculated campaign of prejudice and abuse of power. The wildfire crisis had simply provided her with the opportunity and the excuse to escalate her tactics to an almost unthinkable degree. She had seen Leo, a black autistic child, not as a vulnerable individual needing protection, but as a problem to be eliminated from her sight, a threat to her vision of an orderly, perfect community, even in the face of disaster. This revelation transformed the case from a shocking instance of endangerment into a federal civil rights investigation. The charges against Carol Baxter would now likely include not just false imprisonment and child endangerment, but also hate crime enhancements and violations of fair housing laws. Lena felt a cold, grim validation as these findings were presented to her. Her initial instincts about Carol Baxter, the unease she'd felt about the subtle undercurrents of prejudice in Oak Haven, had been horribly, tragically accurate. The reforms she knew were needed in child protection policies now had an even sharper focus: how to empower communities to protect their most vulnerable from within, how to ensure that local power structures like HOAs could not become instruments of discrimination and abuse, especially during crises when children were most at risk. The news that Carol Baxter's actions were part of a deliberate discriminatory pattern sent a fresh wave of revulsion and anger through Oak Haven. Residents who had once been cowed by her or had dismissed her as merely eccentric and overbearing were now forced to confront the ugliness that had festered in their midst. The HOA board collapsed its members, either resigning in shame or facing intense pressure from the community to step down. Oak Haven was in turmoil, but it was the turmoil of a wound being lanced, painful but necessary for healing to begin. Carol Baxter, the self-proclaimed guardian of Oak Haven's standards, was about to face a standard of justice. She had never anticipated the full, unyielding force of federal law, wielded by a woman whose quiet demeanor had masked a fierce dedication to every child's right to safety and dignity. The battle for Leo's well-being had just expanded into a battle for the soul of their community, and in a larger sense, for the principles of equality and protection nationwide. The public unveiling of Carol Baxter's alleged crimes and the depth of her discriminatory practices occurred not in a courtroom initially, but in a specially convened Oak Haven Community Town Hall, meeting a few weeks after the wildfire crisis had abated. The clubhouse, once the stage for Carol's authoritarian pronouncements, was now filled with a somber, anxious, but determinedly present populace. The air still faintly tinged with the lingering scent of smoke from the distant, now contained wildfires seemed heavy with unspoken emotions: shame, anger, betrayal, and a tentative hope for accountability and change. Lena Washington attended not in her capacity as a resident, but officially as the Chief Federal Child Welfare Officer. She sat at a simple table at the front of the room, flanked by Agent Ramirez and a senior attorney from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Marcus was in the audience, a quiet pillar of support. Sarah was there too, with Leo beside her. Leo, holding his tablet, seemed calmer now, though he stayed close to his mother. He had chosen a bright blue protective case for his device, and occasionally his fingers would tap out a short phrase or select an icon which Sarah would acknowledge with a gentle smile or a soft word. Their presence was a powerful, silent testament to the ordeal they had endured and the resilience they embodied. An interim HOA committee, hastily formed by residents committed to transparency and reform, opened the meeting. Their spokesperson, a retired history teacher named Mr. Henderson, who possessed a quiet gravitas, spoke briefly of the community's shock and the need for a thorough reckoning and a new path forward. He then introduced Dr. Lena Washington. Lena rose and addressed her neighbors, her voice calm, measured, but infused with an undeniable moral authority. She didn't begin with accusations, but with an acknowledgement of the fear and disruption the wildfire had caused, and the general human instinct to seek order in chaos. However, she continued, her gaze sweeping the room. The imperative to maintain order can never, under any circumstances, justify the violation of a child's fundamental rights to safety, dignity, and parental care, particularly when that child is living with a disability and is a member of a historically marginalized community. She then methodically, and with precise, unsparing detail, laid out the events of that day: Leo's distress, Carol Baxter's misinterpretation of his behavior, the forced separation from Sarah, and his unlawful imprisonment in the records room. Gasps and murmurs of disbelief rippled through the audience, even though many had heard versions of the story. Hearing it laid out so starkly by a top federal official, who was also their neighbor, lent it a chilling new reality. Lena then transitioned to the broader findings of the investigation. What happened to young Leo, she stated, was not, we believe, an isolated incident of poor judgment in a crisis. Our investigation has uncovered a disturbing pattern of behavior, a history of actions and statements by Mrs. Baxter that suggested discriminatory animus towards minority residents and individuals with disabilities. She cited specific examples de-identified, but clearly recognizable, to those who had experienced or witnessed them, the unfair, finding the harassment over cultural expressions, the attempts to block disability accommodations. The evidence suggests, Lena continued, her voice resonating with conviction, that Mrs. Baxter sought to use her position as HOA president to create an exclusionary environment, to discourage diversity, and to marginalize those she deemed undesirable. The act of imprisoning Leo, a young black child with autism, appears to be the most egregious manifestation of this alleged pattern. The DOJ attorney then briefly outlined the potential federal charges Carol Baxter was facing: kidnapping, false imprisonment with aggravating circumstances due to the victim's age, and disability deprivation of civil rights under color of law as she was acting in her HOA capacity, and potential hate crime enhancements. The severity of the charges hung heavy in the room. Sarah was invited to speak. She stood holding Leo's hand, her voice trembling but clear. "My son, Leo," she began, looking directly at her community, "is a beautiful, intelligent, loving child. His autism is a part of him, not all of him. He experiences the world differently, and sometimes that means he needs more patience, more understanding, especially when he's scared." Her eyes filled with tears. "What Carol Baxter did to him, to us, it was cruel. She didn't see my son. She saw a problem. She took away his voice, his safety, his mother, when he needed us most." She paused, then looked at Lena. "Dr. Washington, she saw Leo. She saw his humanity. She gave him back his safety, and she gave us hope that this will never happen to another child, not here, not anywhere." Leo, sensing his mother's emotion, reached for his tablet. With careful fingers, he typed, "I was scared. Mom is good. Blue is my favorite color." He held up the tablet. A few people in the audience smiled through their own tears. It was a child's simple truth, cutting through the adult complexities of prejudice and power. Carol Baxter had been strongly advised by her attorneys not to attend, but her shadow loomed large. A few known associates of hers in the audience sat stone-faced, but the overwhelming sentiment was one of shame and a desire for accountability. Hands began to go up. Residents shared their own stories of Carol's microaggressions and overt acts of discrimination, things they had been too intimidated to voice before. A dam of silence had broken. The climax of the meeting was not a shout, but a collective resolve. The interim HOA committee proposed immediate steps: a full audit of HOA finances and bylaws, the establishment of an independent ethics and oversight committee, mandatory inclusivity and disability awareness training for all future board members, and the creation of a community fund to support families with special needs, seeded by apologies and donations from residents. They also pledged full cooperation with federal authorities in the prosecution of Carol Baxter and in implementing any federally recommended reforms. Lena watched, a profound sense of purpose settling within her. The legal battle against Carol Baxter would be fought in court, but the battle for the heart of Oakhaven was being won here, tonight. It was the first step in a long healing process, but it was a decisive one. The community, confronted with the ugliness that had been allowed to fester, was choosing a different path. They were choosing to see Leo. They were choosing to stand for something better. The immediate aftermath of the town hall and the formal charging of Carol Baxter sent seismic waves not just through Oakhaven estates, but across state lines as the story gained national media attention. HOA president indicted on federal kidnapping, hate crime charges for imprisoning disabled black child during wildfire became a leading headline. Advocacy groups for disability rights and racial justice seized upon the case as a stark example of how unchecked local power and prejudice could lead to horrific abuses, particularly against intersectionally marginalized individuals. Carol Baxter, who had once relished her small pond authority, was now the unwilling poster child for systemic discrimination at the community level. Her arraignment was a stark contrast to her former HOA pronouncements. Dressed in ill-fitting county jail attire, stripped of her usual meticulously coiffed hair and imperious bearing, she appeared bewildered and diminished. She entered a plea of not guilty through her court-appointed attorney, her voice barely audible. The federal magistrate judge, citing the severity of the charges, the vulnerability of the victim, and evidence of Baxter's attempts to obstruct the investigation by initially lying about Leo's whereabouts and condition denied bail, Carol Baxter would remain in federal custody pending trial. The iron doors of the legal system had slammed shut on her, a stark echo of the records room door she had so callously locked on Leo. In Oakhaven, the healing process began in earnest. The interim HOA committee, with overwhelming community support, was officially elected. They immediately implemented the reforms proposed at the town hall. An independent forensic audit of the HOA's finances under Baxter's tenure was launched, uncovering not just discriminatory practices, but also questionable expenditures and a pattern of awarding contracts to friends and family, adding potential financial misconduct charges to Carol Baxter's woes. The community rallied around Sarah and Leo with a sincerity that was both heartwarming and a stark contrast to their previous indifference or fear under Carol's reign. Neighbors offered to help Sarah with errands, to provide respite care for Leo, to simply be present as friends. A Leo's Garden initiative was started, transforming a neglected common area into a sensory garden designed to be accessible and welcoming for children of all abilities. Leo, initially wary, began to explore this new space with delight, his tablet often flashing messages of "flowers pretty" or "digging good." He started to make friends with other children in the neighborhood who, guided by newly aware parents, learned to communicate with him patiently and include him in their games. Sarah watched these interactions, tears of gratitude often welling in her eyes. The trauma was not forgotten, but the present was being actively rewritten with kindness. Professionally, Lena Washington leveraged the Oak Haven case with unwavering determination. The stark reality of what had happened to Leo provided a powerful, irrefutable impetus for the Child Safety in Community Crises Act, a piece of landmark legislation she and her team had been developing. She testified before congressional committees, her voice resonating with both the authority of her office and the passion of someone who had witnessed the human cost of inaction firsthand. She didn't just present statistics and policy points. She told Leo's story with Sarah's full consent and participation. She spoke of his fear, his resilience, and the absolute necessity of systems that protect children like him, especially when societal structures like HOAs, vested with quasi-governmental power, failed or actively harmed them. The proposed act included several key provisions directly inspired by the Oak Haven case. Mandatory training for HOA boards and local emergency responders on interacting with and protecting individuals with disabilities, particularly children, during crises. Clear federal guidelines and increased penalties for the unlawful detainment or endangerment of children by individuals acting under the color of local authority. The establishment of a federal rapid response protocol for acute child welfare crises that appeared to involve civil rights violations or discriminatory animus. Grants to support community-led initiatives promoting inclusivity and accessibility for children with disabilities. The bill, dubbed Leo's Law by the media, garnered surprisingly broad bipartisan support. The image of a small, disabled black child locked in a dusty room while a wildfire raged was a potent one, cutting through political divides. Veterans groups, civil rights organizations, and child advocacy networks formed a powerful coalition lobbying for its passage. Months later, Carol Baxter's trial concluded. The evidence against her was overwhelming eyewitness testimonies. Sarah's moving account expert testimony on the psychological trauma inflicted on Leo, recovered emails and HOA documents detailing her discriminatory intent, and Lena's own meticulous documentation from the moment she had intervened. Baxter's defense, attempting to portray her as a well-meaning but overwhelmed community leader making tough choices in an unprecedented crisis, crumbled under cross-examination. The jury, after a relatively short deliberation, found her guilty on all major federal counts, including kidnapping, false imprisonment, and violation of civil rights. The hate crime enhancement was also affirmed. The sentencing was severe. The federal judge, in a scathing rebuke, described Baxter's actions as a monstrous abuse of power, fueled by an appalling prejudice that targeted the most vulnerable among us at a moment of extreme peril. Carol Baxter was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of parole for the first 10. She was also ordered to pay significant financial restitution to Sarah for Leo's therapy and ongoing support, and substantial fines to the federal government. Her assets, including her Oak Haven home, which the HOA had already placed a lien on for the mismanaged funds, were seized. Her downfall was complete, absolute, and very public. The news of the conviction and sentence brought a profound sense of justice and relief, not just to Sarah and Leo, but to the entire Oak Haven community and the many watching across the country. It was a clear statement that such acts would not be tolerated. One sunny afternoon, almost a year after the Oak Haven wildfire, Lena Washington stood with Marcus watching a community fair in the newly revitalized Oak Haven Central Park. Children's laughter filled the air, At the center of it all was Leo's garden, now a riot of color and activity. Leo himself, wearing a bright blue t-shirt, was showing another child how to use his communication tablet to identify different types of flowers. A small group of other children gathered around, listening intently. Sarah stood nearby, chatting animatedly with Mr. Henderson, the new HOA president, both of them smiling. Leo's law passed the final vote in the House this morning, Lena said quietly to Marcus, a deep satisfaction in her voice. The president is expected to sign it next week. Marcus squeezed her shoulder. You did it, Lena. You really did it. You changed the world for kids like Leo. Lena watched Leo confidently tap out a message on his tablet, then look up and grin as his new friend understood. The journey had been harrowing, born of ugliness and fear. But from that darkness, something truly luminous had emerged, a community healed and strengthened, a child finding his voice and his place, and national protections forged in the fire of one brave boy's ordeal, and one determined woman's refusal to let injustice stand. The terror of that locked room would likely always be a shadow in Leo's memory, but it would no longer define him. His legacy, and Lena's, would be one of resilience, justice, and the enduring power of compassion to overcome prejudice. As the sun set over Oak Haven, casting a warm, golden glow on the laughing children, Lena knew that the fight for child welfare was a continuous one, but today a significant victory had been won, its positive ripples extending far beyond their once troubled, now transformed suburban enclave. The echoes of fear had been replaced by the sounds of hope,